It seems like Dana White won't be facing punishment for slapping his wife. After 22 years of countless fights and numerous scandals, everyone's asking one question: how is he getting away with this? Let's find out.
Since that's not a punishment to me. The punishment is that I did it, and now I have to deal with it. And more importantly, you guys know how I feel about other people's opinions of me, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Nobody, I know a lot of you. I don't know what you do when you go home. I don't know what you're into. Nobody knows you better than your kids do.
While Dana is recently embroiled in a domestic violence scandal, this isn't the first time he's been accused of being an awful person to his family. Now, with much more awareness and sensitivity surrounding domestic violence cases, there have been strong calls for White to quit the UFC. Fans were quick to notice how back in 2014, White criticized Ray Rice for brutally assaulting his fiancée. He came out and said his famous "you can't bounce back from hitting a woman" line.
I've heard you say that there are many underlying things, and as you've had time to reflect and really do a deep dive for both of you,
Yes.
what was the answer you came up for yourself about the underlying issues?
But there's something wrong with his morals, because apparently a lot of UFC fighters under his terrain have been initiators of domestic violence in one way or another. Clearly, he hasn't been able to stand up for his views. White confirmed the incident shortly. He claimed that this was the first time such a thing has happened in their household, and they're focusing on their family right now. While Dana doesn't have any plans of stepping down from the UFC as chief, it turns out the UFC feels the same way too. Considering the PR nightmare that Dana caused, UFC was forced to take a big financial hit, with their stocks dropping by 6%. But wait, note this. No one would let major commissions of organizations like the NBA and NFL continue if they were to strike their partners. Now, what are the chances that White might retire on his own? I know Dana said he'll never bounce back from hitting his wife, and while that's punishment enough, but people aren't buying this anymore.
What matters other than my personal life? Nothing. Nothing matters except for my personal life. This is great. Love doing it. Don't have to do it.
UFC and its parent company Endeavor have been facing strong calls to fire Dana following the incident. But apparently, Dana believes that leaving the UFC would hurt the company, employees, and its fighters, and it doesn't matter to him if he leaves or not. Clearly, that's not true. UFC got hit with a PR nightmare, and it will lose fans following if White doesn't step down. What's more ironic is that when asked if NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell should resign following the Ray Rice domestic abuse case in 2014, he replied that Goodell should get out and leave without anyone telling him. So he'll ask every other negligent commissioner to step down, but won't do it himself, and would rather claim that the stain on his reputation is punishment enough. Interesting. But I must applaud White's commitment to the UFC. He said COVID has a possibility of lasting for 10 years, and he was ready to wait it out. Of course, a small slapping incident won't get in the way of White and his aspirations for the UFC. White might not be facing any punishment by UFC, but there's still a bigger picture at hand, and that's the lack of accountability in the UFC. Fighting is one thing the UFC excels at, but the moment it gets out of the ring, UFC tends to look the other way. UFC has a long history of employing fighters who sometimes forget they're out of the ring and lash out on their family. While Dana might have said Commissioner Goodell should have stepped down, he fails to assess his organization in the effort. In 2015, HBO's Real Sports revealed the number of domestic abuse arrests of MMA fighters is over double the average national rate, and ironically, way more than NFL players. It seems like abuse of UFC fighters Dana White let continue. In 2018, Greg Hardy, a former NFL player who was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, made his debut in the UFC on the same event that also featured Rachel Ostovich. What made it worse is that Rachel happens to be a victim of domestic violence. UFC could use a lecture on sensitivity. Sadly, the UFC has been long plagued by domestic abuse, and they haven't done much to rectify the situation. In fact, the UFC has welcomed abusers and harassers with open arms on multiple counts. In 2021, former UFC light heavyweight champion John Jones was arrested on counts of abuse against his wife and kids just hours after he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. He got his charges dropped, but honestly, if you hit your wife and children, you don't belong in any Hall of Fame. Weeks later, UFC Hall of Fame resident Chuck Liddell was charged with domestic violence involving his wife, but the allegations were soon dropped. What Dana White did to his wife barely scratches the surface of what UFC fighters have done. But now is the time to think about if Dana White is fired, will the UFC massively suffer? I might not agree with what Dana White does, but I will agree with the way that he has revolutionized the UFC and MMA since 2001. No one else would have achieved that level of success with a crumbling company. He's rarely missed in any press conference, weigh-ins, or hype video. He knows the show better than anyone, and who better can sell it than him? He's regarded as one of the best promoters of all time, and he sure knows how to hype up his sport. White also introduced the UFC to global markets, with 6 to 7 events on foreign soil every year. Without this level of outreach, it would have remained a regional promotion. He's a skilled salesman, which means he knows what fans want and is out there arranging fights that he knows will sell. He also killed most of the competition in the industry. Many were bought by Zuffa before they went under, and the rest ceased to exist. But still, the reason the UFC flourished was because of smart business decisions and not because of one person alone. If the UFC's chief were to ever retire, he'd be replaced by someone who could replicate its success. It's clear that the brand, the fan base, and the business have grown and established themselves as major players in the sports industry. So it seems like while Dana has turned the UFC around, it has become independent of him now. As far as I know, Dana White won't face punishment by the UFC. But did you ever wonder if he had to be replaced, who'd make the cut? UFC fans have started wondering, who's set to replace the ill-reputed chief? Don't worry, I've got you covered. With a list of sleazy business practices, including denying his fighters medical coverage and underpaying his employees, on top of his recent actions, the UFC might need to switch things up. There are several potential candidates for this role. The list includes all UFC high flyers, starting with Sean Shelby, the current UFC matchmaker, who is known for his ability to make matches and promote fighters. Mick Maynard, the VP of Talent Relations, has experience managing fighters and is the president of the MMA organization LFA. Hunter Campbell, the UFC's chief business officer, has legal experience and can easily handle the behind-the-scenes operations of the company. With the amount of trouble UFC is getting itself into occasionally, someone with his experience might not be a bad addition. Ari Emanuel, the CEO of Endeavor, can serve as the UFC president and keep the business afloat. 2 birds with 1 stone. And finally, Forrest Guffin, a 2-time UFC Hall of Famer and former UFC champion who has experience with fighter relations and oversees the operations of the UFC Performance Institute. Guffin remains a UFC favorite with his goofball personality and might give the UFC a change it so desperately needs. Whoever's set to replace Dana White needs to gear up for an unmatched challenge. That's it for this video. See you in the next one!